Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilman is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 least popular legendary cards throughout the entire year of 2018. And I'm not just making up these rankings, these aren't subjective or anecdotal. I'm actually basing these rankings on the entire year data set from hsreplay.net. They provided that to me so I could go through and see which cards were actually included in decks less than any others. So these really are the 10 legendaries people put in their decks less than the entire rest of the legendary set. So in some ways, I guess you could say maybe the worst legendaries based on community opinion. That said, let's go ahead and jump into this list. At the number 10 spot, we have the Vorax from Journey to and Grow with 24,000 plus deck inclusions in 2018. And you know what? I'm actually a little shocked by this card being on the list. This is not a card I think of as being one of the actively worst cards in Hearthstone. It seems rather harmless. It has some upside on its effect. It never fit into a great deck. Even now, it doesn't seem to make sense in that buff Paladin shell with Spirit of the Tiger and all the cool new buff synergy cards like Immortal Prelate. Vorax still gets left out for some reason. And I'll admit, I kind of forgot about it when building those same sorts of deck lists. And I think that wraps up or sums up why the Vorax is on this list, is because it's just kind of forgettable. It's been around now for almost 2 years, never saw play. It doesn't come to top of mind when you're thinking about buff cards. There's been a lot of opportunities for this thing to succeed, and it never quite gets there. So despite being probably an okay-ish sort of card from a power level standpoint, and certainly not one that's bad for you like a lot of the cards on this list, which have big backfiring elements, the Vorax still, despite all that, doesn't get remembered or played very often, so it comes in at the number 10 spot. Up next at the number 9 spot here, we have Prince Valinar from Knights of the Frozen Throne with 23,000 deck inclusions last year. And this is really the forgotten prince of the three princes. Keleseth sees a ton of play, one of the most defining legendary cards, the most popular legendary cards in Hearthstone. Prince Tal'Daram, not quite at that level, but still sees competitive play in things like Q-Block. And then Valinar never quite made sense or made the cut. And that's because he has that same huge sacrifice that the other two princes have, but the upside on Valinar is just not worth it. Getting Lifesteal and Taunt isn't really that big a deal at the end of the day. It's still just a 4-mana 4/4, and that's okay. It's all good to have. Yes, a 4-mana 4/4 Lifesteal Taunt would be played, but in comparison to the sacrifice you have to make, it's not nearly worth it. There are other good defensive 4-mana cards that do almost as much or more, and they don't make you compromise at a huge extent like Prince Valinar does, because there are a lot of other good 4-drops in Hearthstone and key cards at that 4-mana spot. So this guy, just way too hard to work with, and he's just not worth it. There's not enough there, even when he succeeds, to make sense at all. So it's a big sacrifice, a big deck restriction problem, and that's why he doesn't see any play. Moving on here, we have Dr. Morrigan from the Boomsday Project with 22,000 deck inclusions. And I think all I really have to say about this card is that it's been something like 5 months since it was released, and I still haven't found a way to put it into a Dexperiment. And as you guys probably know if you watch this channel, I experiment with cards in all kinds of crazy, kooky, wacky styles. I play things that are bad all of the time, but I still haven't been inspired by Dr. Morrigan, and I can't even figure out a reason to put this card into that Dexperiment environment. How do you even experiment with it? It just doesn't make sense. It just seems so fundamentally bad to me. Terrible stat line, an effect that probably fails or backfires most of the time. Even if you do set it up to work perfectly, it just requires, all kinds of setup, and these consistency problems come into play. So I'm not at all surprised to see this card. I think it's one of the worst cards in Hearthstone. Very awkward, very hard to use. Warlock has a ton of great tools, of which this is certainly not one, so it gets left behind compared to all the other great Warlock options. Dr. Morrigan fitting for this list, and if at all surprising, only because she's not even higher than this spot. And now at the number 7 spot, we have Harbinger Celestia, another card which just looks fundamentally terrible, and yet again a card I don't even know how to experiment with. The Boomsday Project had a couple of these very bad legendaries, not just average or unplayed, but actively bad, things that just seem so terrible and hard to work with. And theoretically, sure, there is a world in some meta where your opponents are only ever playing big, awesome minions, where Celestia makes a little bit of sense. Or maybe if they're playing 0 minions, she makes a little bit of sense. But a vast majority of the time, 99.9% of the time, this is a card that's so easy to play around and punish, and a huge tempo sacrifice that it just doesn't make any sense to be played at all. I would love for Blizzard to create some kind of world where this thing makes sense. But in the meantime, Harbinger Celestia really is one of the worst cards in Hearthstone, and that's why nobody's playing her. Moving on here, we have Grifter from Rastakhan's Rumble. And this card was identified by a lot of people before the expansion came out as a rather weak card. It just looked like a Chillwind Yeti that didn't necessarily help you and could sometimes really backfire and hurt you. And so far, we've seen that it isn't seeing much play. I've tested it a little bit just to have some fun. It is an interesting card and can create some great, hilarious moments for streamers like me. But for somebody who's looking to make a good deck, there's really not much reason to run Grifter. And that's why it only has basically 15,000 deck inclusions in 2018. But keep in mind, this card did come out in Rastakhan's Rumble, which means it really only had like 3 or 4 weeks of data here to be played at all, as opposed to most of the cards on this list, which have had the entire year. So they had 365 days instead of like 25 days in 2018. So if you're someone who wants to look at this at a more kind of balanced level and you want to normalize the stats a little bit, Grifter would not be on this list if it wasn't released in the last month of the year. Clearly, this 15,000 would expand much, much bigger if you multiplied it by 12. Grifter would be nowhere in sight. So he actually has been experimented with and played a fair bit compared to some of these other cards, just hasn't had the time to accrue that many inclusions. Now, some people will say that's a weakness of this video. I don't care. We're looking at it by calendar year. I'm not trying to be subjective or weight these in any significant way. We're just looking at the raw data. So take it as it is. If you wanted to try to normalize these, you certainly could. As you can imagine, the Boomsday Project cards might not be on this list either. This is an even greater example of that. But I'm just looking at it as is, straight up for the calendar year. And that means Grifter is, in fact, on the list. Now at the number 5 spot and beyond, we're not going to see any new cards. All of these had the entire year to be played, and they still weren't played. So these truly are the bottom of the barrel, the worst legendary cards in Hearthstone, the cards you just can't afford to test or experiment with. You can barely afford to have fun with them because they just cost you too many games. Up first at the number 5 spot, we have Temperous from Kobolds and Catacombs with less than 13,000 deck inclusions in the HS Replay dataset over the entire year. And that's just because Temperous is so risky. Giving your opponent 2 turns, it turns out, makes you lose the game a lot. And then even sometimes if you don't lose the game, when you get your own 2 turns, sometimes it's hard to follow up and win the game. If you don't have some really dedicated, crazy game plan or the perfect hand, it still doesn't help you win. So there's just a lot of risk and very rarely much reward. And even when that reward does exist, it usually comes at great compromise to any other sort of game plan or strategy. Even when you got this guy off random card generators, like adding dragons to your hand from things like Bone Drake, it's still too risky to play. And that doesn't even mean running it in your deck. Yeah, occasionally there are those highlights where you do something crazy cool because of Temperous, but most of the time you just can't afford to play this card onto the board, and you certainly can't afford to play this card in your deck. Up next at the number 4 spot, it's Azruk from Journey to Unguro with 11,000 deck inclusions. And although I think this in some ways was kind of supposed to be this big centerpiece of the elemental package, this neutral legendary that could be tossed on to the end of any elemental deck and create this enormous threat that's a 5/25 or some insanely big taunt, at the end of the day, it just doesn't work that well. It's usually a 5/10 or 5/15 best case scenario. Beyond that, 9 mana is a lot to spend on a single minion that really just has taunt and a lot of stats. When you compare this to other cards, things like maybe Obsidian Statue, for instance, that are just by default big, awesome taunts with lifesteal and a death rattle that destroys a minion, Azruk doesn't even compare, right? This card is so much weaker. And then, of course, you have to put it into an elemental dedicated deck. And that means that you're doing all these other things to make it work, which can compromise your deck. So despite all the fireflies in the world out there and the ability to make this big, it's just too weak, too inconsistent, too susceptible to both silence and removal for that big of a mana commitment. And that means it never made it into elemental decks. It does occasionally see some play when generated off of like Servant of Kalamos or whatever other elemental generator you might have, but that's about it. And that means nobody runs it in their deck. Elemental decks are usually considerably faster than a card like this could ever support. So Ozruk, despite being this kind of crowning champion of elementals, falls really far short and never actually gets played next turn. Up next here at the number 3 spot, we have Millhouse Mana Storm with 8,000 deck inclusions. And I'm pretty sure this is the worst card in Hearthstone. Turns out making your opponent's spells cost 0 is really, really bad. They play a 0 mana ultimate infestation. The hunter drops 5 secrets all at once on top of a couple animal companions. And really, no matter what deck you're playing against these days, 99% of the time, they're going to completely blow you out if you drop Millhouse Mana Storm in the early game or the late game or basically any other time. And that means this card just can't be afforded to be in your deck because it's going to lose you games regularly and quickly. So nobody plays Millhouse Mana Storm. Now, I'll be honest, I thought this card would be number 1 because of that giant downside. But I do think there was a very small, brief window with early in the Witchwood meta when Call to Arms was still 4 mana and even Paladin was out there. Some people were including Millhouse Mana Storm to be summoned off of Call to Arms as a big 4/4 body when normally you'd get much smaller minions. So the stats benefit you, but you don't have the downside of the battle cry. And I think that probably accounts for like half of the deck inclusions here for Millhouse Mana Storm, and that's why he's only in the number 3 spot instead of at the number 1 spot where he belongs, because truly, this is the worst card in Hearthstone, and it should be the least popular legendary of the last year, but also every other year in Hearthstone in the past and into the distant future. Millhouse Mana Storm absolutely sucks. But in 2018, 2 cards sucked more. The first of which, the number 2 spot, is Murabi with only 6,000 deck inclusions on the year. And for Murabi, it's really just coming down to the fact that Freeze Shaman as an archetype is absolutely abysmal. And frankly, Murabi is a pretty bad card. Even if Freeze Shaman did somehow work, I don't think Murabi would ever be a centerpiece of that deck. Bad stat line, very value or resource focused effect as opposed to a tempo focused effect makes Murabi a problem to play. You're sacrificing a lot. It takes setup, it takes commitment in your deck, and even then the payoff isn't necessarily that great because there's no like super freeze like Frost Nova available to Shaman. So Murabi never really made sense because you don't need to generate that value. You often need more tempo, more control, more direct influential board impact, especially when you're requiring a few other cards to support Murabi. He doesn't stick around on the board for long. He's just bad, and his archetype is bad. So Murabi never saw any sort of play. He's not good on his own. His deck that he fits into sucks, and even then, he's bad inside of it. All that means this card just gets forgotten and left at the wayside. No surprise here at all that Murabi just doesn't see any play. And then finally here at the number 1 spot, we have Dusk Fallen Avianna with less than 6,000 deck inclusions. For all the good cards Druids had in its life, this certainly wasn't one of them. The same problems that face Millhouse Mana Storm also face Dusk Fallen Avianna. There's just way too much risk in giving your opponent 0 cost stuff. Often that also means they can clear Dusk Fallen Avianna with whatever cool 0 cost play they can make, which then means you don't get to benefit from the 0 cost either. So you basically played an averagely statted minion that gave your opponent some just distinct and enormous advantage at, pivotal mid-game point. So Dusk Fallen Avianna just doesn't make any sense. I thought there might be some world out there where you could keep her alive, protect her, play her into like 0 mana Malagos and do some crazy cool stuff with her. But nobody has ever solved that puzzle. I think it's an impossible puzzle to solve. And I think Dusk Fallen Avianna very quickly was identified right the moment she was revealed as a terrible card. And she has lived up to that fate beautifully because she is an absolutely miserable card. I know Druid is in a miserable spot right now. Duskfall and Avianna is certainly not going to do anything to save the class as I can see it. If she had stealth, if she had 15 health, if her stats were way better, maybe she had a glimmer of hope. But as she stands right now, this card is basically unplayable. All that said, it's really no surprise. The Duskfall and Avianna here takes the top spot, or I guess you could say the bottom spot, as the least popular legendary card of the entire year. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this list. The 10 least popular legendary cards. Now, I want to hear your take. What did you think belonged on this list? What were you surprised to see? What card did you think would make it on this list that didn't? I'm always curious to hear your take. But before you leave those, I hope you'll join me real quickly as we jump over to hsreplay.net to check out how you might find similar statistics to these, because clearly this video would not have been possible without them. And I think you might enjoy keeping up in the future with these same sorts of stats moving forward. So I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. Okay, so here I am over on hsreplay.net, and although there's a lot of fun stuff to see on the homepage, we're going to head up here to the cards tab to look at cards individually in a little bit more detail. And in this video, we use the in percentage of decks metric here to sort these. So how often were they included in a deck that queued up for a Hearthstone match if you're running the Hearthstone deck tracker? And you can see here right now for all cards, Ziliax is the most popular over the course of the latest patch, which is like a few weeks of data at this point. But we want to look at legendary specifically like we did in this video. So we can go down here, sort by legendary. We can go ahead and move it to the last 14 days to get a narrower view. You could go down to 1 day if you really wanted a specific look, particularly if you're looking at like new decks and stuff that are the most prominent. Premium will offer you that, which is a $5 a month fee. I have it. I've had it for like 2 or 3 years. As soon as it was available, I think I started paying for it because I like being able to look at the stats as closely and as accurately and as up to date as possible. So for me, it makes a ton of sense. You can check that out, I think, by hitting the premium tab up here if you're curious for more info. But for now, we'll stick to 14 days because I'm too lazy to sign in. And we're going to go ahead and go the other direction here. We want to filter by the least played cards in this case. And you'll see here over the last 14 days, we got some similar numbers. Millhouse Manastorm has, in fact, moved into the number 2 spot over this small window here at the end. Maybe, again, because of what I said previously about the call to arms, perhaps he got more play early and he's kind of losing ground right now. Duskfall and Avianna, though, still the least played, which is absolutely miraculous. Also has a lower played win rate than Millhouse Manastorm, which I can barely believe, but it's true. But you'll see here, mostly a similar top 10. Some surprises there. Sharazin Corpse Flower, for instance, moving down a card, I guess, that's being forgotten in Rogue. But again, a card that's not bad, so just kind of gets left out, I guess, from time to time. But who's who? Veritable who's who of the worst legendary cards of the game here. Prince Valadar has gained some steam lately, it seems. He's not nearly as low as he used to be. But nonetheless, a fun way to view cards, perhaps in Hearthstone, that you might want to disenchant or you might want to avoid in your deck building endeavors because they're not going to serve you too awful well. So I think you can play around with this and find lots of more cool views and cool stats. That's exactly what hsreplay.net provides. So all that said, let's go ahead and close out this video. All right, folks, so share your thoughts below. I always like reading your insights. You guys have some very cool perspectives on these sorts of things. But until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.